I want us to turn to the book of 1 Kings, the first chapter, and we'll begin reading with the 5th verse. Before I begin reading that, I might mention that just recently I found some tapes that would help, I guess, as you get older, improve your memory. So I thought, well, I'll get that. And I got those, and this author said in there that the mind thinks in pictures. And what you see in a picture, you can remember much better. And when I heard that, I thought, well, how kind of the Lord. Because this is what so much of the Old Testament is about, is a picture for you, and He has put the truth in a picture. So these just aren't kings or people, they're pictures for us. And He has put them in a person. Well, how kind of the Lord, so that we really get it. Now here is a picture that I want us to get this morning, and first of all, of course, if I were to title this, I'd title a family sermon. I'm trusting it'll be good for fathers, for mothers, for teenagers, for husbands and wives. I'm trusting that this will help in all of these areas. But here, the first thing I want you to know, I want you to get a picture of the self-life. God's put it in a picture for us. Look in 1 Kings now, the first chapter, starting with the 5th verse. Maybe I ought to give a little background. David, the king, is old and is about to die. And he has two sons here. I want you to see these two sons. Here's Adonijah and Solomon. Now, Adonijah is one of his sons, and he wants to be king, and so he gathers some of his friends around and declares himself the king of the kingdom. Now I want to start reading here with the 5th verse. It says, Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself. Now I want you to get, now here's a picture of the self-life. He exalted himself, saying, I will be king. Boy, if that doesn't picture the self-life, I don't know what does. I'm going to be king. I'm the king around here. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, Why hast thou done so? Think of that. This young man, his father had never displeased him in all of his life, or the New International Version says, his father never asked him, Why are you acting like this? His father never once in this young man's life did his father ever correct him. Now, can you imagine that? No wonder he thought he could be king. And he was also a very goodly man. That is, he was a handsome man. And his mother bare him after Absalom. So here's this young man, had never been corrected. And he is going to be king. Imagine that. Well, Zadok the priest, here's Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba and that, they found out about it, and so they went in to David and told him, and David then, of course, got Solomon because he had promised Bathsheba that Solomon would sit on the throne. So he got Solomon, and he put him on the throne, and Solomon was made king. Well, as we look at this, I want you to see just a little bit here of the self-life. Here is a young man that's never been corrected and doesn't know how to rule himself, and he wants to rule a kingdom. Now, this is such a beautiful picture of the self-life, for the self wants to rule, and it's sure that it can rule. Now, self is sure that it knows the answers to everything. If you don't believe that, you can just start with a little child. And that child is sure it knows the answer. Parents will say to him, now look, don't do that, you'll get hurt. What's the answer? I won't get hurt. It's sure that it knows how, it knows how to protect itself, and it's sure it knows the answer. And you can come on into a teenager or in that area, and most teenagers that I know are sure they know the answers. They're quite sure they know better than their parents. Come on now. Don't look there like you wonder what I'm talking about. Most teenagers feel like they know pretty much better than what their parents do, and their parents try to tell them, but they're sure they know the answer. Self knows. Now, if you don't believe that, how many of you think you know what the president ought to do? Here's the whole government of the United States and world conditions and conditions in Bosnia and Africa and all that's over the country, race situations and all over. How many people sit around and I tell you the president ought to do this and he ought to do this and he ought to do this. If he listened to me, he'd take care of this situation. Now, you know what I'm talking about. Most people pass a judgment on the president, and they sit around and talk about it and tell him, I'll tell you what he ought to do is this. Just ask me, I know the answer. I got you, didn't I? Self knows the answers. Don't blame this young man. He knew the answer. He was going to be king. He said, I would be king, and he declared himself to be king. He said, I will be the king. So we're sure we know. Labor unions, they know how, and I'm not against labor unions, but I'm just talking, they know how the company ought to be run. They know what the managers ought to do. If you want to know how to run a company, ask the laborer. He knows. Come on now. I'm talking about the self-life, and God has given us the picture of a self-life here in this young man. So labor unions, they know how to run a company. Well, if you don't still believe me, let's look at a church. How many people think they know how a church ought to be run? And Rodney back here grinning. Well, I know what the pastor ought to do. I tell you, if I was pastor, I'd do this, and I'd do this, and I'd do this, and if he just listened to me. And most people know how a church ought to be run. And they know what the pastor ought to do. Isn't that something? Yeah, they know. Self knows. Self knows the answer. But what a picture. See, God's painting a picture for us so we can see what Adonijah, so we can see ourselves. That's why we get up and talk about denying self. Why is he talking about assumption? Because that's what we need. So here it is, and self simply knows how to, and they know what a pastor ought to do. And how many people get upset with a pastor because he's not doing what they think he ought to do? Because he knows, they know. If you want to know how to run a church, just ask some of the people in the congregation. A lot of times the pastor doesn't know, but they know. Well, I want to switch this over, and I want us to look here at this young man, his other son, Solomon. Now, David had his two sons. I want to look at this young man. And this young man evidently had the self-life dealt with. And when he was put on the throne, and you can see that by the book of Proverbs. You see, when he says to he that spareth the rod hateth his own son, he was talking about himself. You read the book of Proverbs, and when Solomon is giving out the instructions, he's talking about what happened to him. And he's talking about how his mother died. Evidently his father didn't, because his father evidently is busy with the kingdom and didn't correct Adonijah. I doubt if he did Solomon. And so we read in the book of Proverbs here, and we can find that no doubt that Solomon here is talking about himself. He was writing about himself. Well, I want us to look here in 1 Kings, the 3rd chapter. God put this young man, and his self-life had had the self-life dealt with. The 3rd chapter, starting with verse 5. And Solomon now has been put on the throne. He's already made king, David, and it's a sure thing with him. He has been made the king. And after he's been made king, starting in the 3rd chapter of 1 Kings, the 5th verse, it says, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon said, thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, but I am a child, and I don't know how to go in or come out. You've made me king, and I don't know how to run the thing. I want you to see the difference. Here's a young man, Solomon, that self-life had been dealt with, and he doesn't know how to run the kingdom. The other one that had never, self-life had never been dealt with, he knew how to run it. He said, I'll be king, I can run the thing. But David, or Solomon, had the self-life dealt with. When he got in, he said, oh God, I'm but a child. I don't even know how to go in or how to come out. I don't know how to rule these people. Why? The self-life had been dealt with in Solomon, and it proves it in the book of Proverbs. He said, I don't know how to go in or come out. He said, give therefore, he said, and thy servant in the midst of this, he said, I know not how to go in or come out, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. I don't know the difference between good and bad. That I may know the difference between good and bad. For who is able to judge this so great a people? Lord, he's saying, God, I don't know of anybody living that can judge your people. What humility. And the speech pleased the Lord. No wonder God was pleased with this young man. And so God said to Solomon, I'm not only going to grant your request, I'll make you the wisest man that's ever lived. There's never been anybody like you before nor since. And not only that, but I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for. How gracious of God. I want to tell you, self that exalted self lost out all the way around. Here's a young man, the self-life has been dealt with. Brother, he got kindness from the Lord, and God dealt with him graciously and gave him far more than he even asked or think that he could have ever asked for. I'll give you honor, God said, and riches. And if you'll obey me, I'll give you long life on top of it. What a marvelous thing. How God deals with an individual that'll say, God, I don't know. I often think of that in Ezekiel. I think it's such a beautiful statement of Ezekiel when the dead bones were out there, and God said to Ezekiel, can these bones live? And he said, Lord God, thou knowest. I don't know. I think of that as a marvelous answer in so many things. Oh God, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know what it is, but you know. And now here, see, this is a marvelous thing, and I marvel at this, that Solomon didn't know the answer. He didn't know how to rule. Here's a young man, and he doesn't know how to rule, and I marveled at that, because self always knows the answer. So here self has been so dealt with in this young man. Now, if it had been an old man and said, I don't know the answer, I could understand that a little bit. Maybe he's had so many failures, he's not sure of himself now, but here's a young man, and he said he doesn't know. That's because the self-life had been so dealt with him. So God gives Solomon the wisdom to rule. And then he wrote these beautiful Proverbs. And I want us to look at some of these. However, I want us to, let's look at the 31st proverb. As we look at this, it says in this, the words, the 31st proverb, starting with the first verse. It says, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. Now, I want you to notice here that what he's bringing out here, he said his mother taught him. Now, it says King Lemuel, and if you'll try to find that out, nobody knows. There's no record of a King Lemuel. And nobody knows who he was, and scholars feel like it's another word that means maybe oracle or something, and that he really really this Lemuel is Solomon. And if that's the case, Solomon's talking about what his mother taught him. Some of these marvelous, wonderful proverbs had been instilled into him by his mother. Now, he's not talking about his wife, he's talking about his mother. But I want us to look here down at some of these verses. Look at the 28th verse. It says, her children rise up and call her blessed, and her husband also, he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. So he says here that her children will rise up and call her blessed, and her husband will praise her. And he said there's many daughters have done virtuously. Now, I want you to see, this is a beautiful thing between husbands and wives. He's saying here that many daughters will praise her, but he said, I want you to know that here she excels them all. In other words, her husband is saying of her, he thinks she's the greatest woman in the world. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if all the husbands could feel that way about their wives? Well, I'm going to tell you, my wife, she's the greatest woman in the world. That's what he's talking about here. He said her daughters will praise her, but I want you to know that she's the greatest of them all. She's greater than any of these daughters. And she's the greatest woman on earth. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What a kind of a home would that be if every husband thought his wife was the greatest? This is the words of wisdom coming out of Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. And if you husbands, if you want some wise words, you're supposed to consider your wife the greatest woman on earth. Well, I think that's words of wisdom. I think it's wonderful, marvelous. And but there's a secret to this all. I want you to look at verse 30. It says, favor is deceitful. Or I think that word favor is charm, is deceitful, and beauty is vain. Now, that's something that he would know, that charm is deceitful, and vain, beauty is vain. How many people know that? I really don't know if very many people know that. That charm is the way he puts it here, and in King James, it says favor is deceitful, or the New International Version says charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. I tell you, the self I really had to have been dealt with in Solomon for him to come up with that. He said, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. What's he looking for in a woman? He's looking for a woman that loves God. Ooh-wee. Boy, and I don't think I'm not cutting across human self-life here and human nature. What are most men looking for in a woman? Charm and beauty. And the Bible says, the wisest man out there, he said, that's vain. Brother. Isn't this something? I know I'm hitting close. Because I know what human nature is. I haven't lived 78 years for nothing. I've seen human nature in a lot of conditions and circumstances, and here it is. But here the Bible brings this out, that charm is deceitful. I didn't write this.